Let's talk about ships that explode, deliberately. But first, some context. During the Age of Sail, fire was a sailor's most dreaded enemy. A man of war at sea was a floating fortress, but she was a highly flammable floating fortress. Her hull was made from oak, flammable. She had canvas sails, flammable, hemp rigging, flammable, planking sealed with tarred oakum, also flammable. Oh, and her hold was filled with barrels of pitch, gunpowder, and spirits. Very flammable. In battle, she might withstand iron shot, shattered spars, and flooding from hits below the waterline, but if a fire broke out and its flames took hold, her crew's courage and seamanship could count for little. If fire control efforts failed, the ship became a floating bomb. Perhaps the most famous example of this occurred during the Battle of the Nile in 1798. The French flagship L'Orient took fire just after 9 p.m. Her fire control efforts were hampered by continued and focused bombardment by the British ships, and it soon became uncontrollable. As the glow from the raging fires lit up the surrounding area, the nearest British and French ships ceased fire, closed their gun ports, and began to edge away. And they had good reason. L'Orient was a 118-gun ship of the line, and her magazine held something in the range of 33 to 40 tons of gunpowder. Her explosion was so powerful that despite edging away, several ships were seriously damaged, and flaming wreckage was scattered across a 500-meter radius. Fire was the greatest threat a warship of that era faced. As a result, navies imposed extremely strict and codified rules about open flames aboard vessels, and this wasn't just about preserving their ships. Sailors dreaded fire. A ship taking on water could often be fought for and saved, or at worst, men could often get away in the boats. Fire was immediate, chaotic, and often fatal for all aboard. Writers from the period would repeatedly refer to fire as the most dreadful of all perils at sea. Nothing else had such a shocking and demoralizing effect on a ship's company, and unless a ship was manned by excellent officers, fear and panic caused by a fire would often seal a ship's fate before the flames did. The fire ship turned that fear and panic into a deliberate instrument of war. Recently, in our video about William Dampier and his ill-fated voyage to explore the coast of Australia, a few people expressed surprise that the British Royal Navy had commissioned a dedicated class of fireship, and that inspired me to make this video to explain a bit more about them. So, what was a fireship, and for how long were they used? Well, despite the presence of some dedicated classes, they were more often than not an elderly or expendable hull, sometimes a worn-out warship, other times a purchased or requisitioned merchantman, prepared for a single fiery mission. Its decks and holds would be packed with brushwood, tarred reeds, resin, sulfur, barrels of pitch, and oil. Its guns were often left primed and loaded, so that they would discharge as the fire reached them, adding further to the terror and confusion of a fireship attack. In the later periods of the Age of Sail, the more sophisticated examples were fitted with wooden lattices or troughs, lined with material and matches to further spread the flame. There were barrels beneath chimneys to send the fire up into the rigging, and grappling hooks on the yardarms so that once they struck an enemy ship, they clung on like a blazing leech. The fireship's power was not merely material, its greatest effect was often psychological. In a crowded anchorage or a tightly formed battle line, the sight of a flaming vessel drifting downwind, sails and rigging already ablaze, could be enough to make even seasoned captains cut their cables and break formation. Even when it caused little direct damage, the fireship could sow confusion at the crucial moment of a naval engagement, exposing the enemy fleet to attack by more conventional means. And as for their use, your typical fireship saw its heyday in the 17th and 18th centuries, but depending on how you interpret the term and the concept behind a fireship, its use can extend from over 2,000 years ago all the way up into the modern era. So with that in mind, let's start at the beginning. Fire at sea had been dreaded since the first plank-built ships ventured from the shore, and long before the age of cannon, burning ships were already being used as weapons. One of the earliest recorded examples came during the Siege of Tyre in 332 BC. Alexander the Great had built massive timber causeways and siege towers to reach the island city. The defenders counterattacked by loading an old merchant hull with pitch, oil-soaked brushwood, and other combustibles. They then towed it out with galleys and, setting it alight, drove it straight into the wooden towers. A century and a half later, in 149 BC, Carthaginian sailors would repeat this stratagem at the Battle of Lake Tunis. They lashed together rafts and hulks and piled them up with tarred timber, set them alight, and let them drift downwind into the anchored Roman ships, several of which were then burned down to the waterline. Fireships in antiquity were not merely limited to the Mediterranean, though. In China, at the opening of the 3rd century AD, the Great River Battle of Red Cliffs would feature a dramatic use of this type of vessel. The commander, Hung Gai, prepared a flotilla of decoy supply ships, packing their holds with reeds, timber, and jars of oil. Under full sail with the wind behind them, he feigned defection to the enemy, but then at the last moment he set fire to the ships and steered them straight into Coggeshall's tightly moored fleet. The blaze spread from ship to ship to ship and helped shatter a force many times greater than its opponent. Perhaps the most famous use of these ancient fireships came in the year 468, when the Western and Eastern Roman empires launched their invasion of the kingdom of the Vandals. But it wasn't the Romans who used them to astounding effect. The combined Roman invasion fleet supposedly had over 1,000 ships and ferried more than 50,000 soldiers and thousands of horses. It was one of the largest naval operations in antiquity, and it was thoroughly defeated. During negotiations, with the Romans anchored off Cape Bon, the Vandals launched a nighttime fireship attack that took advantage of the prevailing winds that kept the Romans pinned to the shore. The Roman fleet was thrown into chaos, and the main Vandal fleet followed up to press their advantage. At the battle's conclusion, one half of the Roman fleet was burned, sunk, or captured, and the rest had fled. The campaign was a total failure for the Romans, and it was a major contributing factor to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Following this dramatic event, reports of fireship use between the 5th and 16th centuries are scarce or conflicting in detail, but the use of fire in naval warfare did not disappear. In the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire unveiled the terrifying secret of Greek fire. This was a petroleum-based liquid that was projected from bronze siphons or carried in grenades. It clung to hulls and continued to burn even on water, much like modern-day napalm, and for centuries it gave the Byzantine navy a near mythical reputation. Crusaders returning from the eastern Mediterranean brought home a renewed appreciation for incendiary devices. By the later Middle Ages, European warships often carried firepots, flaming arrows, and tar-filled rings or pikes meant to be hurled or dropped on an enemy deck in close combat. However, I digress. Though effective throughout antiquity and the medieval period, the use of burning ships in war was always ad hoc. Sporadically used, usually unmanned, they were easily dodged if the enemy was alert and had room to maneuver, and they could be easily as dangerous to the side that launched them as to their intended targets. It would take the rise of permanent, gun-armed sailing navies to make the fireship a regular weapon of war. The transition from medieval sea-fighting tactics to the modern Age of Sail line of battle doctrine transformed the fireship from a desperate expedient into a recognized class of war vessel. The spread of heavy cannon turned warships into floating batteries, and the target of naval combat shifted from attacking the opposing crew to the enemy ship itself. Fleets were no longer temporary gatherings of converted merchantmen, but standing national institutions. They were important assets, and they were symbolically, strategically, and financially valuable. In that new environment, a vessel whose sole function was to spread fire to enemy ships and fleets, now laden with dangerous quantities of gunpowder, took on a much greater significance. The first great turning point in this new era was not at sea at all, but on the River Scheldt, during the 80 Years' War between the Spanish Empire and the Dutch, at the Siege of Antwerp in 1584 to 1585. There, the Dutch rebels, desperate to break the Spanish blockade, employed the Italian engineer Federico Gambelli to create two ships which would soon be called Hellburners. Now, these things were fireships on steroids. Gambelli converted two vessels, Fortune and Hoop, into floating mines. Each had a vaulted chamber of brick and stone buried deep in their holds, packed with thousands of pounds of gunpowder and surrounded by rubble and iron scrap to magnify the potential damage of the blast. One would be detonated by a conventional slow-burning fuse, and the other by a clockwork flintlock device that was devised by an Antwerp watchmaker. When the vessels were cut adrift and sent down the river towards the great timber and pontoon bridge the Spaniards had built to blockade the city, most Spanish soldiers watched on with contempt, but without much concern. When Fortune ran aground and only partially exploded, her explosives fouled by the water, the Spaniards broke out in derisive laughter and antic gestures. But when the Hoop struck the bridge and her clockwork fuse activated, the ship erupted in a colossal explosion. The blast shattered a large section of the bridge, hurled debris for hundreds of yards, and killed almost 800 men outright. Both defenders and attackers were left stunned by the first true use of a floating bomb in European warfare. The story of that explosion raced through European ports. For decades afterwards, sailors and admirals would speak of the terrible Dutch machines of fire. Unsurprisingly, those aboard Spanish warships were particularly disturbed, and 3 years after the explosion at Antwerp, this had a direct impact on the next major event that featured fireships, the Spanish Armada of 1588. For more than a week, the English ships had harried the great Spanish fleet as it worked its way up the channel, but gunnery alone had failed to sink a single vessel. When the Armada anchored off Calais in a defensive crescent to await the Duke of Parma's army, the English commanders switched to a different tactic. They hastily prepared 8 elderly merchantmen, bought or donated by Drake, Hawkins, and other sea captains, crammed them with pitch, tar, hemp, brimstone, and brushwood, and left the guns primed so that they would fire as the flames reached them. In the small hours of the 8th of August, the burning hulks were set adrift on the night tide, heading straight towards the massed Spanish fleet. By the time the Great Spanish Armada had anchored, the fear of the Hellburners had been alive and growing in the minds of every Spanish captain for nearly 3 years. It was rumoured that the Italian inventor Gambelli had been recruited by the English to produce more of these infernal machines. In fact, Gambelli had been recruited by the English, but he was busy building harbour defences, not improvising explosive bomb ships. But that made no odds, as the Spanish were convinced that something was afoot. Thus, when off Calais, the English commanders unleashed 8 blazing hulks upon the Spanish fleet, the psychological effect of the attack was far out of proportion to the flames themselves. The fireships caused no direct loss, but they achieved what conventional attacks had not. They panicked the Spanish Armada. Convinced that these were not merely fireships but hellburners primed to explode and shatter their hulls, the Spanish cut their anchor cables in panic and scattered out to sea. Once scattered, the cumbersome galleons were exposed to English manoeuvre and gunfire, and they were driven into their disastrous retreat around the north of Scotland. The psychological impact of this attack was a lesson not lost on the English or other European powers. Through the first decades of the 17th century, as standing navies took shape, most major powers experimented with keeping fireships as permanent auxiliaries. By the time of the anglo-dutch wars in the mid-1600s, they had become standard fleet units. These wars, pitting the two foremost maritime trading powers against one another, saw the fireship at its peak. At the Battle of Lowestoft in 1665, a pair of English fireships destroyed 6 large Dutch warships that had fouled each other's rigging. Fireships proved equally devastating in harbour raids. In 1667, during the Dutch raid up the Thames and Medway, Dutch fireships would sweep past the boom defences and set ablaze major vessels lying at their moorings. The Third Anglo-Dutch War opened with another triumph of the fireship. In the Battle of Solebay in 1672, Dutch vessels pressed home attacks on larger English warships. The flagship, HMS Royal James, already battered by gunfire, was grappled by a fireship. The blaze spread too quickly to be checked by fire control, and Admiral Edward Montague, the Earl of Sandwich, drowned when his overcrowded boat capsized in the attempt to escape. By the late 17th century, the fireship had well and truly become a distinct type of war vessel, and the Royal Navy now produced some specialised examples. A good representative design was the small 6th-rate sized ships built or converted in the early 1700s, vessels such as HMS Vulcan and later HMS Lucifer. The English had a flair for giving them very appropriate names. They were generally of about 300 to 400 tons displacement. They were ship-rigged and armed with a light battery of 10 to 16 guns, enough to defend themselves in an ordinary skirmish, but not enough to withstand prolonged engagement. Their real weapon, of course, lay below the decks. In the waist of the ship, the builders created a fire room, a section where the deck planking had been cut away and replaced by a wooden lattice or trough system that was lined with tarred reeds, brushwood, and other combustibles, along with slow match. Barrels of pitch, resin, and sulfur were lashed beneath square wooden chimneys, called fire trunks, that pierced the forecastle and quarterdeck and acted essentially as giant vents which would direct flames upward into the sails and rigging, setting them alight incredibly quickly. The gun ports were hinged at the bottom, so that as the ship burned, they would drop open by their own weight and the pressure from within, venting the heat and the blast of flames outward instead of blowing the entire sides of the ship apart. This allowed the fire to spread further through the ship as it made its way in towards the enemy without structurally compromising it. Long spars with iron grappling hooks were fitted to the yard arms so that once a target was struck, the burning ship would tangle itself in the enemy's rigging and hold fast. A special sally port, or a low-cut door near the stern, gave the fireship's crew a quick way to step into the waiting boat, which lay secured by a chain. Obviously, having a rope securing the boat on something that was on fire was probably not a very good idea. The sally port was made so that as the slow matches were lit, the men could quickly get to the boat and row clear, leaving the vessel to do its fiery work. The whole design reflected hard-won experience, not just in the best ways to effectively and controllably set a ship alight and keep it alight for a long period of time without exploding too soon, but to also make sure the flames spread as quickly as possible into the enemy's sails and rigging, while also adding in features that allowed the attacker's crew at least a fighting chance to get away alive. At the time, it was often said that men who volunteered for a fireship had one foot already in the grave, and part of that fear came from the widespread rumours that captured fireship crews would be shown no quarter. By this time, fireships were seen as especially hateful weapons. They attacked not with deliberate and honourable accurate gunnery, but by burning ships and men alive indiscriminately. Pamphlets and memoirs from the Anglo-Dutch Wars occasionally repeat the claim that a fireship's crew, if taken alive, could expect to be hanged from the yardarms, and it's mentioned loosely in several novels set during this period. In practice, though, there is no serious evidence that summary executions were standard practice or even remotely common. Surviving Dutch and English accounts describe fireship sailors who were taken prisoner in the usual way, when their boats were captured before they could escape or after their burning vessel had failed to reach its target. They were generally treated as legitimate combatants and exchanged like other prisoners of war. The notion of no quarter seems to have been part of the psychological drama of the weapon. It heightened the aura and dread surrounding the fireship, adding to its reputation as both a desperate and dishonourable weapon of war. The last truly spectacular successes of the traditional Age of Sail fireship came at the twin actions of Cherbourg and La Hogue in 1692 during the War of the Grand Alliance. After the main battle, the French first-rates Soleil Royal, Triomphant and Admirable, along with others, took refuge beached in the shallow water. English longboats had something else to say about this, and they towed in their fireships under a hail of iron shot. But within minutes, the stranded French three-deckers were ablaze and soon burned down to the waterline. But such opportunities were becoming increasingly rare. As fleets learned to fight in open water, navigate, and keep good way on their ships in close combat, the slow-moving fireship found fewer and fewer victims. Through the 18th century, the number of purpose-built fireships dwindled quickly. By the Napoleonic Wars, they were little more than anachronisms, and the Royal Navy's last dedicated-built fireship, HMS Theiss, was converted into an ordinary sloop in 1808. Although regular fireships faded from use, commanders occasionally revived the old tactic in desperate circumstances. The most famous example of the Napoleonic Wars occurred when the audacious captain Thomas Cochrane led the British assault on the French fleet anchored in the Basque Roads in 1809. A flotilla of old transports, stuffed with combustibles and fitted with grapnels, was sent drifting in with the tide. The attack succeeded in throwing the French into disorder, and several ships ran aground under British fire. But this outcome was now the exception to the rule, and the day had passed when a fireship alone could decide the general outcome of a fleet action. However, in the Greek War of Independence, the weapon enjoyed a remarkable last huzzah. The Greek Revolutionary Navy, outmatched in heavy ships by the Ottoman fleet, relied on fast local brigs and converted merchantmen. In the narrow waters of the Aegean, agile Greek captains repeatedly crept in by night with burning vessels. The most dramatic success came in 1822 when one such vessel grappled the Ottoman flagship, the 84-gun Mansur al-Liwa off Chios, and set her blazing from stem to stern. Even as late as 1827, the presence of fireships was still a cause for concern. Ottoman fireships in the combined Turkish-Egyptian fleet featured heavily during the Battle of Navarino, the last major naval battle to be fought entirely with sailing ships. But this final event was mostly symbolic. The British and French had allocated smaller, fast warships specifically for fireship interdiction, as they had correctly gauged that the Ottomans would try and use a lot of them. And only one Ottoman fireship succeeded in getting close. By the middle of the 19th century, steam propulsion, copper-sheathed and later iron-hulled warships, and the growing reach of shell-firing artillery had removed the conditions in which the slow-moving, burning ship could work its terror. The traditional fireship had had its day, but this wasn't quite the end of things. The disappearance of the wooden sailing man-of-war did not end the general idea and concept of a fireship. It merely changed its materials and its means of propulsion. Whenever an enemy held a position behind strong defenses, or when conventional fleets could not close the range, commanders were tempted to send in a sacrificial vessel laden with flame or explosive. In the American Civil War, the Confederacy, when short on heavier ships, would turn to fiery alternatives. On the Mississippi River, on several occasions, they would set adrift crude fire rafts, which were essentially just flat boats stacked with tar-soaked timber and kindling, with the goal to float them down to the Union fleet and hopefully cause a fair amount of chaos and destruction. The effect was usually more psychological than material, for the Union gunboats could often sheer off or tow the rafts aside, but the sight of a flaming vessel drifting downriver in the night still had a power to unnerve. By the 20th century, the age of sail was long past, but the concept re-emerged once again in a new and deadlier form: the explosive attack vessel. In March 1942, the British Royal Navy undertook Operation Chariot, which was aimed at the huge dry dock at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. This was the only dry dock in occupied France that was large enough to service the German battleship Tirpitz. An elderly Lend-Lease destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, was stripped, packed in her bows with 4.5 tons of delayed action explosive charges, and camouflaged as a German vessel. Manned by sailors and commandos, she was taken into the port, and under heavy fire, she was rammed squarely into the dry dock gates. Hours later, the hidden charges exploded, wrecking the dock and blocking it for the rest of the war. But it wasn't just the British who made use of this sort of vessel. The Axis forces too made use of small expendable craft. The Italian Navy deployed fast MTM explosive motorboats. Essentially, they were piloted torpedoes whose bows were packed with a charge set to detonate on impact. In March 1941, a handful of these tiny craft penetrated the Allied anchorage at Suda Bay in Crete and crippled the heavy cruiser HMS York. These events proved that even in an age of steel plating, high-powered diesel engines, and many high-caliber guns, a lightly built and expendable explosive boat could still deliver a decisive blow. Even today, we can still see its use. In the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, the idea became associated above all with asymmetric warfare and terrorism. In October 2000, the American destroyer USS Cole was attacked by a small civilian speedboat laden with explosives. The blast tore a gaping hole in the hull and killed 17 sailors. 20 years later, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a new generation of unmanned surface vessels, essentially robotic fireships guided by camera and satellite links, were sent skimming across the Black Sea to strike at Russian warships in Sebastopol. The concept and the method, when stripped down to their barest essence, has changed relatively little since the days of the Spanish Armada. A comparatively cheap, expendable vessel sent in where larger ships cannot go to strike a sudden and demoralizing blow. Across more than 2 millennia, the Fireship has been a weapon of both destruction and dread. Its heyday lay in the centuries when fleets of wooden hulls, closely anchored in line-ahead formations, fought at short cannon shot, and in that environment it could be decisive, sometimes as at La Hogue by direct burning, but more often as at Calais by sheer panic and disruption. Its decline in the 19th century was not because the idea itself had lost its force, but because the physical conditions that had made it so deadly had changed. Steam engines freed ships from the wind. Iron plate and later steel armor made them far less flammable, and long-range shell guns allowed battles to be fought at distances far beyond the reach of a drifting hulk. Yet the underlying principle has proved stubbornly persistent. Time and time again it has re-emerged whenever one belligerent has needed a cheap and sudden way to reach into a defended harbor or to harass a superior naval force. The names have changed: fire raft, infernal, torpedo boat, explosive launch, drone, but the idea remains recognizably the same. And that, my friends, brings this slightly rambling exposition on the history of fireships to a close. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on our next video. And of course, to appease the temperamental machine spirit that controls the YouTube algorithms. But no matter what you do, farewell and fine seas until next time, and remember to always be sure that you are choosing the lesser of two Weevils.